Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. For this deep dive, we're going to be looking at TSMC. We've got
Hmm.
their recent financial report and their latest earnings call transcript. And we're really going to try to give you a clear understanding of, how they're doing, what their prospects look like, and, what all of that means for potential investors.
Yeah, this is a really interesting time for TSMC. They're the biggest contract chip maker in the world, and there's a lot of stuff going on with them.
Right. Yeah. So before we really get into it, I mean, for those out there who may not know, could you give us the quick rundown of what exactly TSMC does?
Sure. So basically, TSMC is what's called a foundry, and that means they make chips for other companies.
Yeah.
So a company like Apple or AMD or NVIDIA will design their own chips, but they'll have TSMC actually manufacture them.
So kind of the master craftspeople of the chip world.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. And one of the things that makes TSMC so special is that they've invested a ton of money in developing the most advanced chip making technology in the world. So they can make chips that are more powerful and more efficient than anyone else.
So they've got like a real competitive edge there.
Yeah, they've got what's called a wide economic moat, which basically means it's really hard for other companies to compete with them because of their technological leadership.
Interesting. And we see that playing out like in their recent performance, right? Their Q4 2024 results,
Yeah.
they blew past expectations.
Yeah, they did. They had a revenue surge of almost 39% year over year.
Wow, that's huge. What do you think was like the main driver behind those strong results?
Well, a big part of it is the explosive growth in AI. TSMC makes a lot of the specialized chips that are used in AI applications, and that market is just booming right now.
So they're really riding that AI wave.
Yeah, they are. In fact, they're predicting that their AI revenue is going to double in 2025 and that they'll see like mid 40% growth in that segment for the next 5 years.
Sounds pretty promising. So it's not just AI though, right? What else is contributing to their projected growth?
Yeah, so TSMC is also expecting to see strong growth in other areas like smartphones, high-performance computing, the Internet of Things, and automotive.
So they've got their fingers in a lot of pies.
They do, and they're all getting bigger. They're predicting like a 20% compound annual growth rate for the next 5 years across the board.
But to achieve that kind of growth, they're going to need to make some serious investments, right?
Absolutely. And their capital expenditure plan for 2025 is somewhere between 38 and $42 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
What are they planning to spend all of that on?
Well, a big chunk of it is going to go towards developing even more advanced chip-making technologies. They're really committed to staying ahead of the curve.
Makes sense, given how much of their success is tied to their technological leadership.
Right, but of course, with all this talk of growth and investment, there are some potential challenges on the horizon.
Right, like what?
Well, one thing that some analysts are worried about is margin dilution.
Could you explain what that means?
Sure, so basically it means that their profit margins might shrink, even if their revenue continues to grow.
Interesting. How could that happen?
Well, there are a few reasons. One is that they're expanding their overseas production facilities, which can be more expensive to operate than their fabs in Taiwan.
So going global could actually hurt their profitability.
It could in the short term, at least.
Yes.
Then there's also inflation, which is pushing up the cost of everything. And then there are the costs associated with converting their production lines to newer technologies.
So even with all of the positive projections, they're facing some headwinds when it comes to their costs.
Yeah, but it's important to keep in mind that even with those challenges, TSMC is still projecting a long-term gross margin of 53% or higher.
Okay, so that's still really good. But, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the geopolitical risks.
Yeah, we can't ignore those.
Especially given that TSMC is based in Taiwan and there's, ongoing tension between China and Taiwan.
Absolutely. That's a major concern for investors.
So how are those geopolitical risks playing out right now?
Well, one big thing is that the U.S. has implemented restrictions on China's AI business. And since TSMC is a major supplier of AI chips, that could potentially impact them.
Right. But what has TSMC said about those restrictions?
Their management has said that they believe the impact will be manageable. They're applying for special permits to continue doing business with some of their Chinese customers, and they're also focusing on serving customers in other parts of the world where there aren't any restrictions.
Okay, so they're adapting to this situation, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing that investors are worried about is whether TSMC will be able to meet the growing demand for their chips. They're already running at near full capacity, and it takes a long time to build new fabs.
So are they doing anything to address those capacity concerns?
Yeah, they are. They're working on improving the efficiency of their existing fabs, and they're also investing in new capacity. But it's going to take some time for those efforts to really ramp up.
Got it. So now let's talk about their current valuation.
Yeah.
Their share price is trading at a bit of a premium right now.
Yeah, it is a little above the fair value estimate.
So investors are willing to pay a premium for a piece of TSMC. But does that make sense given everything we've talked about?
Well, I think it does. I mean, TSMC is the dominant player in a really important and rapidly growing industry, and they have a proven track record of success.
So that premium is really a reflection of their strong market position and their potential for future growth.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about TSMC's business,
Hmm.
their growth prospects, and the risks they're facing. Now let's really dive into their financials and see what they tell us about their overall health and their future potential.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at their financials. What are some of the key things that stand out to you?
I think one of the most impressive things about TSMC is their track record of consistent revenue and net income growth. If you look back at their performance over the last few years, you can really see that upward trend.
Right, so they're not just surviving, they're thriving. But what about their cash flow? I mean, that's always a key indicator of a company's financial health.
Yeah, absolutely. And their cash flow is strong too. Their operating cash flow has been growing steadily, which means they're generating a lot of cash from their core business operations. And that gives them a lot of flexibility to invest in future growth, pay dividends, or even buy back their own stock.
Speaking of dividends, what's their dividend policy like?
Well, they've been paying a dividend for a number of years now, but the yield is relatively low compared to some other companies in the tech sector. That's because they've been prioritizing reinvesting their earnings back into the business to fuel further expansion.
Which makes sense given how quickly the semiconductor industry is evolving.
Yeah, exactly. They need to keep investing in new technology to stay ahead of the curve.
Okay, so we've talked about their revenue, their profitability, their cash flow.
Hmm.
What about their balance sheet? What does that tell us about their financial stability?
Their balance sheet is rock solid. They have very manageable debt levels, a substantial cash reserve, and a well-diversified asset portfolio.
So they're in a good position to weather any potential storms.
Yeah, they are. They've got a really strong financial foundation.
But even with their strong financials and their promising growth prospects, we still need to talk about those geopolitical risks.
Right. Those are definitely a factor that investors need to consider.
So let's break those risks down a bit further. What are some of the most pressing concerns from a geopolitical standpoint?
Well, the biggest worry is obviously the potential for a military conflict between China and Taiwan.
Right, that's the worst case scenario. But it's something that we can't just ignore.
No, we can't. If there were a conflict, it would severely disrupt TSMC's operations. And since they produce such a large percentage of the world's advanced chips, that would have ripple effects throughout the global economy.
It would be a major shock to the system.
Yeah, it would. So that's definitely something that investors need to be aware of. But even if we set aside the possibility of an actual conflict, there are still other geopolitical risks that could impact TSMC.
Like what?
Well, there's the risk that China could try to exert economic pressure on Taiwan, maybe by trying to isolate them diplomatically or disrupt their trade relationships. And then there's also the constant threat of cyber attacks.
So geopolitical risks are complex and multifaceted.
Yeah, they are. And they could have a significant impact on TSMC's business.
So it's a delicate balancing act for investors.
It is. You have to weigh the potential rewards against the risks.
Okay, so given everything we've discussed, what's the bottom line for potential investors? What are the key takeaways from our deep dive into TSMC?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that TSMC is a dominant player in a critically important and rapidly growing industry. They have a lot of strengths, including their technological leadership, their financial stability, and their strategic investments.
They're a powerhouse in the semiconductor world.
They are, and I think they're well positioned for continued success.
But there are also risks that investors need to be aware of.
Right, those geopolitical factors we talked about are a major wild card, and they could have a significant impact on TSMC's future.
So it's a classic high-risk, high-reward scenario.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our discussion of TSMC's financials and the risks they're facing. Thanks for breaking all of that down for us.
No problem. Happy to do it.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about all the ways that semiconductor technology is shaping our world.
It's everywhere you look.
Exactly. So before we let everyone go, I just want to kind of recap what we've learned today about TSMC. What would you say are like the most important takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that TSMC is the undisputed leader in a really critical industry,
Yeah.
and they're in a very strong position financially.
Right, they're a global powerhouse.
Exactly. And they have a really solid track record of growth and innovation.
But as we've discussed, there are also some significant risks that investors need to be aware of.
Yeah, those geopolitical tensions are definitely a wild card, and they could have a real impact on TSMC's business.
So it's a classic risk-reward trade-off.
Right? Investors need to decide for themselves if they're comfortable with that level of risk.
Exactly. But for those who are willing to take on that risk, TSMC offers the potential for some pretty substantial returns.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay, so to wrap things up, I just want to say that we've only scratched the surface of TSMC and the semiconductor industry today. If you're interested in learning more, we've included some links in the description below.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive and you want more insightful analysis of the companies and industries that are shaping our world, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any of our future episodes.
We're here to help you navigate the complex world of finance and investing. So until next time, happy investing, everyone.